Hi there, and welcome to Pax Politica. War, conflict, and military engagements are nothing new for us as a people. But there's indeed a feeling of romance and fantasy around them whenever and wherever they take place. Perhaps by decades of media coverage with graphic images and spine-chilling footage. For those who live, breathe, and witness conflict from close quarters, however, it leaves behind a slew of emotions that shape the way we see the world and societies as human beings. More so, if stories from battlefields follow you home. Today we speak with one such person in Colombia, a country ravaged by over 5 decades of civil strife with one of the world's largest guerrilla groups, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as the FARC. A person who grew up in a period that marked arguably the deadliest period of violence in its history. Mariana Cepeda today works with local and grassroots communities across the country that are actively working towards reshaping and rebuilding their lives nearly a decade since the historic peace agreement signed in 2016. In this riveting discussion, Mariana talks about what it was like growing up in the 1990s in Colombia, building peace with local communities, donors within peace building, and her thoughts on what lies in Colombia's future. So, stick around and don't forget to subscribe for more such content. Hi, Mariana. Thanks so much for being on our podcast today. Welcome to our show.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. So, you're from Bogota, right? The last time we met?
Actually born in Cartagena in the Caribbean coast. But I moved to Bogota when I was 9 years old.
What brought you here?
My dad's work.
And what does
He
he do?
used to be in the military,
Ooh.
in the Navy.
What
yeah.
year, what part of Colombia was this in? Like, what, was this in the 90s?
In the 90s, yeah. I was born in 1982 in Cartagena and moved to Bogota in 1991.
So his military posting
Yes.
brought
Brought him
to Bogota. Oh,
And
cool.
we came along with him.
And was he like a senior commander in the army?
Yes, he was. He worked for President Gaviria
Okay.
from 92 to 94.
So I'm guessing that must have been a pretty interesting time for you and your family, right? Personally, you've got the conflict going on one side. Your father comes home, well, with stories, with a little bit of stress. What was life like in your family at that time when you were growing up?
It was actually very scary. It was the time of Pablo Escobar.
Right.
So my dad would leave at 4 in the morning and come back at 11 o'clock when he wasn't traveling.
Wow.
And we used to hear in the news everything that was going on with Pablo Escobar. So it was very scary. Some days you didn't know if he was gonna come back or not. So
how did you feel when Escobar was finally killed?
relieved in some way, but the conflict kept going on. So.
And did the conflict take him to many different places as well in Colombia?
Well, he was in charge of the president's security. So while Gaviria was president, he had to travel a lot with the president to different parts of Colombia. So.
But then from what I've heard and read, like Colombia has a history, almost a track record of presidents or presidential candidates being assassinated on elections or prior to elections. So did your father ever have, concerns related to his security, knowing fully well that other former presidents in the past have suffered as a result of assassinations?
Well, I don't know if he didn't let us know about that fear, and I've actually never talked to him about him being afraid, but he tells us stories about situations that he faced in a very general way.
Do you remember any of them?
He doesn't talk much about it. And I guess it's something that he did not to scare us even more. But it was pretty scary, like the bombings here in Bogota.
Right.
So we used to have to change like the routes we used to take to school, just, to be careful.
Was he part of the military operation when, I think if I recall correctly, it was the M19 that stormed the Justice Palace?
He didn't participate in that, yeah.
Ah, okay, okay. But then, did his career and the situation that you had at home, did that shape the way you looked at Colombia?
Of course.
In any way? How so?
I think it made me become interested in understanding what was going on about the conflict, and that's why I majored in political science. In 94, we moved to the US.
Okay.
And I decided to come back here and study political science.
Despite everything that was going on?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Why?
That sense of giving back to your country, basically, to understand what was going on and to help in any way you could, basically, or you can. So that's what made me come back.
Was it any one particular event that strengthened that emotion for you?
Well,
Anything
I think
happened?
that the fact that he worked with President Gaviria very closely, so I grew up in that environment. And
which year did you decide to come back?
2001, that's when I came back.
I think that was just a few years before Alvaro Uribe became president, right?
Being a president, yeah.
Now, from what I've read and heard, the conflict during President Uribe's tenure reached, pretty nasty heights.
Yes.
Did that change the way you looked at things at all? Did that basically change the way you? Did that make you question your decision to come back?
No. It wanted me to work on this even more.
Really?
Yeah.
And so what did you do then? Did you study further or did you?
I studied further.
Uh-huh.
I actually had the chance to work during the second term of President Uribe.
Okay.
I worked for the National Planning Department.
Okay.
On security issues, actually. For some reason, I ended up being there.
What does the planning department have to do with security?
Well, they have different sectors in the National Planning Department.
Okay.
They divide. It's divided into different sectors. So I ended up in the Justice and Security Unit in the National Planning Department.
So talk to me a little bit more about that. What was your job like?
So I was just starting out, so it was very basic. But I do remember we had to draft a document, a report on how the conflict had escalated or was behaving. And I remember that we received an order from the presidency to change the census, to use the previous census of Colombia, because the new census, which was in 2005, I think, was the period, made the conflict look even worse than it was. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Because of the population.
It makes perfect sense, but did you actually believe that?
No, I was against it, but I was just starting out my career.
So you just decided to go with the flow?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we had this huge discussion, I remember, with my bosses there.
Okay.
And we decided to publish it anyway, but we did include a note, like a footnote on the report, that we were using specifically the census and to take into account that the numbers, the comparison of the numbers might change because of the census, of course.
And being a researcher yourself, was simply adding like a disclaimer or a footnote, was that enough for you?
No, it was not enough for me. It was not.
How did that make you feel, knowing that you're in a position where you've got to further your career, but you're working in an institution that, is adopting measures or doing certain things that you don't agree with?
Yeah.
What was that like for you, being in a position
awful.
like that?
And that's why I decided, after 2 years working there, I decided to move into an NGO, for example.
Which
That's
one?
something I did. Transparency for Colombia.
Okay.
Which is the Colombian chapter of Transparency International here.
Okay.
And I worked there for a year. And
And what was that like? Or how was that experience? Working for an American institution in Colombia, having their own
they're Colombian
agendas.
because they're very independent from TI, from Transparency International. They're independent. They have to follow certain like rules, or I don't know if you can call them rules, but some guidelines.
Okay.
But it was hard for me at the beginning because they were very critical, which was something that I wanted and that I liked, but critical sometimes in a way that ignored how the government works and the bureaucracy around it and the limitations that civil servants face every day when they do their jobs. Like, for example, what happened to me. Like, the only thing that I could have done was to say I'm not going to continue with this job, right?
Would you say it's the classic Western attitude of where they believe that, oh, we're a democracy, we invented democracy, these are our principles, these are our values, you don't match up to that, so whatever you do is trash. Was that sort of symptomatic of such an attitude?
Yeah, and I think there was like all of us, like the people that we were working on this project were very disenchanted, maybe, of how things work.
And 1 year later, you decided to exit
change.
stage right.
Yeah, and then I went back.
Where? To the US?
No, to the National
government?
Planning Department. Yeah.
Was that a decision you...
Because it wasn't all bad. That's just like one thing that I did not like about my job there. But there were other things like the supporting the government agencies in their planning tools was really important for us.
Why?
Because it's the efficient use of the resources that we have. So we supported them drafting, for example, the projects that they were going to implement in a year.
A lot of people I've met and spoken to say that during President Uribe's time, the government was, for the lack of a better word, obsessed with eliminating the FARC.
Yeah.
Eliminating guerrilla groups. So did you feel that in the job that you were doing, there was a lack of appropriate prioritization or importance given to what you were doing?
So I felt when I was working during Uribe's presidency, what I felt was that our history was being ignored. Again.
How?
So for 50 years, Colombia used the same tactics in ending a conflict, right?
Okay.
And it never worked. And it just made things worse. And we were using the same tactics. So I was like, have you not read the story of Colombia? It's like it's repeating itself. So this is not going to take us anywhere. I felt the same way during Santos' first term. At the end of his first term, I started to see things different. Because he was shifting that military focus to let's get to the root of the problem. And that's something that I feel that he tried to do with the peace agreement.
A lot of people, some of them being heavily critical of the government, Colombian governments in the past, they often say that President Santos was the defense minister during Alvaro Uribe's presidency, and he was instrumental. In fact, both of them, Uribe and Santos, they worked hand in glove and were instrumental in carrying out a number of attacks on civilians. They were mostly responsible for falsos positivos cases. And during Santos's own tenure, he wanted to break away from the image he had developed for himself under Uribe's presidency, which is why he wanted to use his second term as political leverage to leave a legacy behind for which he may be known. And that's partially true because, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Is that a sentiment you agree with?
Right now, yes, I do.
And at the time?
Well, at the time, I didn't know what was going on inside. Many people say, for example, that he started negotiations while he was Ministry of Defense. That he was sort of preparing the grounds for that to happen.
And during this entire time, you were still with the planning department?
Yes, I left the planning department in the National Planning Department in 2015 when I moved to the US to get my master's degree.
Actually, so 1 year before the peace agreement was signed.
Yeah.
And
I was actually at the voting tables in Washington, counting the votes.
For the plebiscite?
The plebiscite, yeah. Because
This is really interesting. This I really want to talk about more.
So I had a problem because my ID was registered here, which means that I could have only voted here.
Yeah.
So I went to the consulate in DC and I was like, is there anything I can do so that I can vote for the plebiscite?
Right.
And they're like, you can be a volunteer to count ballots. And I was like, count me in. So I was at the voting in DC, counting votes.
What were you hopeful for? Like the country votes yes to the peace agreement, or?
No, I was absolutely sure that it was going to come through.
And how did you feel as you were counting the votes? Okay, the no's are increasing.
I remember I was crying. I was like, I cannot believe this is happening.
Really?
Yeah. And my dad, I remember my dad, who was in the military.
Yeah.
You may think that he was against the peace process. I remember him having an argument with someone outside the building where the voting was taking place.
Yeah.
Because they were saying that they were excited about the plebiscite not going through. And he was really upset. He's like, this is the only chance that Colombia has to finally have peace.
Why? What were his main reasons for wanting the peace agreement to go through?
No, I think that he just believed that the things that the past governments were doing were not being successful, and that this was the chance for things to be different.
And he wholeheartedly agreed with the principles of the peace agreement that President Santos had developed?
Yeah.
Completely, in 100% agreement.
Well, I remember him having some issues with some part of the peace agreement.
Yeah.
But mostly, yeah. Like he did have some issues with some specific parts.
And what about you? Did you share his disagreements?
No.
But you agreed with the peace agreement?
Of course, 100%. 100%.
But then you also knew, right, that at the time that the plebiscite is purely a tool to gauge how the country feels about the peace agreement, but not necessarily legally binding.
Yeah, but that decision, I think that President Santos made a mistake there.
How come? What kind of mistake?
Doing it through a plebiscite. It was very risky, and I think that he found out afterwards that it was very risky because it didn't go through. I think that it would have just be a state decision. Like, this is what we agreed on, and this is what we're signing.
How did the other people of Colombian nationality or descent around you in the United States, how did they feel about it? The people who were counting the ballots with you, how did they feel?
They were very disappointed as well. But I remember, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I was in a VIP table.
Okay.
And I remember that only 10 votes got to my table. And there were many tables, and I only counted 10. And I remember just one vote being against the plebiscite.
Huh?
One vote out of the 10.
Okay.
And I know who voted for the no.
How? Like, ballots are supposed to be anonymous.
Anonymous, yes, but I knew one of the persons who voted, and she was open about, not wanting the peace agreement.
But what I don't get is that so many Colombians, especially the ones I've spoken to, in their personal lives, they got to a point where they were practically tired
Yeah.
of hearing about the conflict, witnessing the conflict, experiencing it through their families like you. It seems a bit almost counterintuitive to me that they would vote against a peace agreement that would effectively end the conflict for good.
Yeah, but I think that there was a campaign around the plebiscite that made people scared.
What do you mean?
I remember that there were like misinformation about what was in the peace agreement, and not many people read the peace agreement. If you look at the peace agreement, I have it right there. It's huge. Like, not many people actually took the time to read and to see what was actually there.
Yeah.
They made a decision based on what they heard on the media. And there was a campaign with President Uribe against the peace agreement.
Hi there. Hope you're enjoying this video. If you've stuck around so far, I'd just like to take a moment of your time and appreciate your support towards helping us keeping this channel up and running. If you like the work we do here, the stories we tell, and the issues we cover, please do hit the like button under this video and subscribe to our channel. Every like helps YouTube's algorithm in recommending this to more people just like you, and in the long run, allowing us to keep producing similar content. So if you haven't liked this already, now's your chance. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make about the media, because somebody I was talking to earlier happened to mention that Colombians in general are not a population that reads a lot.
Yeah.
They like to watch or listen.
Yeah. Listen, especially.
Yeah, so the two radio stations.
Yeah, radio stations. If you look at the main cities, there are TVs, but if you go to rural areas,
Yeah.
much of the decisions that are made are based on radio, more than TV, for example, or other forms of media.
The same person also told me that the two dominant radio stations, one of them being RCN and the other name...
Caracol?
Caracol, yeah, exactly. They, for better or for worse, they promote the government's agenda. Now, at that time, one can only assume that the government's agenda was to, get the peace agreement through. But then why would radio stations go against that?
Yeah, but you have to remember the power that President Uribe had back then and still has. And he was against the peace agreement.
So that period also marked a fracture between Santos and Uribe. And that played into the conscience of people. But it's surprising to me, I'm just trying to connect the dots here, it's still a bit surprising to me that people would continue supporting Uribe during President Santos's tenure, knowing fully well that he was directly or indirectly responsible for a number of people who died at the time, innocent or otherwise. Why do you think that was the case?
That's a very good question. And I don't think I have an answer to that.
But when you were counting the ballots and the plebiscite then failed, what did you do? Did you continue staying in the States, or did you come back?
No, I stayed there. Because I was just starting I was in the middle of my master's. Yeah.
Okay. And then once you graduated from your master's did you then return to
Yes,
Colombia?
I did.
Did you feel that there was something different about the people here?
Yes.
How come? What was different?
It was, I don't know how to say it, but it was just like in the air.
Okay. Like there was relief?
There was relief, there was hope about things changing.
But then people I met also said that, okay, look, we got the peace agreement signed, but former combatants are still, looked at with suspicion. Even though they're trying to integrate into life, normal civilian life, they're looked at with suspicion. They are not really welcomed. There is a segment, a very strong segment of Colombia's population that doesn't want to engage with former combatants at all. So, even though you describe Colombia as, well, being in an atmosphere of relief and all near celebration, did you still feel an undercurrent of tension running in society?
Yeah, and I think that's normal. After many years of conflict, like shifting that mindset to we're in peace now and everything's going to be okay, it takes time. And I think it was something that I do believe is that it's very ambitious to think that in 10 or 15 years, there's going to be peace when the peace agreement was signed.
Do you believe there will be peace in Colombia, now or in the future?
I don't know, but I think that peace building takes time, and it's a process, and it's different. Like, we've lived it in so many different ways that it's very difficult. But for me, something that was very powerful was to see victims of the conflict, direct victims of the conflict, whose children were killed, whose husbands were killed, to be living, for them to believe in the peace agreement and in that process. For me, it was like, if they can believe in this, like, why can't I, right? And I also think there was like, there's a problem. If you read the peace agreement, it's a beautiful text.
I've heard.
It is beautiful. And everything's in it for me, personally. Or most of the things, or most of the important things are in it. But that the problem is to implement it. And I think that's something that we need to realize, that it's something that takes time. It's shifting the culture of a country, of the state, of how the government works.
When did you first come across the word peace building?
Construcción de paz. When the peace agreement, we talked about peace, but construcción de paz, or peace building, I think it was when Colombia was going through the peace process. For me.
So what did then, before you went to the US for your master's, or when you were doing your undergraduate degree, what did peace mean to you? Was it exactly what the government believed? Oh, we want to eliminate the FARC. We want an end to the conflict.
No, I think that my definition of the concept of peace building has changed since 2016.
Tell me more.
So for me, peace back then, I would have said no conflict.
Okay.
No conflict, no FARC, no ELN. That was peace for me. I think that my concept now of peace building is much more complex.
How so?
So I think that peace building has many different layers, and it depends. Like for me, for example, peace building is something that perhaps someone in Montes de Maria sees it completely differently. Right? So for me back then was lack of the presence of the state in these territories. Now I would say that sometimes the presence of the military in these municipalities creates more conflict than peace, for example.
Fair enough. We'll talk about this in a while. But when you came back from the United States, what is it that you wanted to do then?
Okay, so when I came here, I did not know I was going to work on peace building.
Okay.
So I work at the Accountability Research Center, and their main focus is not peace building. It's accountability, it's transparency, it's anti-corruption, it's citizen participation, it's citizen oversight. But for some reason, we started talking about peace building. And I had no idea I was going to work on that. And before, I told you that I mentioned that before going to the US to get my master's, I went back to work for the government. I worked there for 3-4 years on transparency and anti-corruption, which had nothing to do with peace building.
But many people would say that,
or little to do with peace building.
Yeah, but many people would often say that, at least under the Sustainable Development Goals, peace building actually doesn't have a mention. Peace building itself is not a goal. So there are aspects to peace building that relate to different SDGs. Mm-hmm. So why did you then believe that transparency, accountability, trust was not actually peace building?
Well, and I do think that the concept in Colombia of peace building also shifted.
How?
In that it was only seen as a security issue, as the military.
Oh, okay. Right.
Now it's looked at in a more comprehensive way. And that's something that the peace agreement did, I think.
So after the peace agreement...
Of course, the discussions go back before the peace agreement on peace building. And there's...
So
but for the normal citizen, it was security and the military presence in those municipalities, I feel.
So after the peace agreement, did people start looking at or believing in the value of state presence, infrastructure, socio-economic needs,
of course,
political representation? They began looking at these issues with more importance? Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's something I want to dive into a little deeper. Many people I've interviewed for this podcast have told me in so many words that the lack of opportunities in Colombia is what drives people to take up arms.
Absolutely.
Or to adopt violent means. 8 years since the signing of the peace agreement, the sentiment hasn't really changed. So in your line of work, with the communities you visit, with the places that you go to, do you find this sentiment strengthening and deepening, or do you find the government actively trying to, provide remote, far-flung communities with better access to opportunities and meeting their social...
Well, I think that's in the mindset of the government, but I'm not fully sure we're achieving that goal. And I think that the government needs to work even farther in that, right? So peace for me, peace building has to do also with water and basic sanitation, with agencies, the justice agencies being in place in the municipalities, to having access to justice, health, education, opportunity, like economic, and social opportunities. It has to do with I don't know, many things that are important for that community that will not, or will make it hard for the people of that community to take the decisions to take up arms, basically.
Before we dive deeper into this, do you see yourself as a person of privilege?
Yes.
Okay. To play the devil's advocate here, do you believe, with the circle that you keep, the people that you meet, the conferences you attend, that peace building is a circle reserved for the privileged? Is a line of work reserved for people with privilege? Access to language, access to opportunities?
I think that there are many initiatives taking place on the ground of people that you may consider not privileged that are very important. And that's something that we try to work with.
I'll tell you why I'm asking this. We first met at Shift the Power Summit.
Shift the Power, yeah.
Right? I found
Which was for privileged people.
Exactly. I'm getting to that I'm getting to that right away. I found that conference ironical upon reflection itself, because it attempted to encourage people, organizations, networks even, to promote and work better with grassroots communities and initiatives that are essentially trying to build peace. But there was a fundamental and a grave lack of representation from grassroots communities
Of course.
to begin with. I would assume and like to think that the situation within peace-building circles in Colombia is no different. A number of people, for example, I've met for the podcast have said, look, you want to interview communities, you want to interview survivors, victims, or speak with former combatants, you got to step outside Bogota.
Yeah.
You have to visit the territories and stuff. And I completely agree with that sentiment. Having said that, I've noticed and observed that peace-building work, at least the policies and resources that drive peace-building work with a top-down approach, happen from big cities.
But not only on peace building, on every other public policy. That's the problem that Colombia has, I think, that everything is handled in the center. And people here in their desktops are taking decisions without knowing what exactly is going on the ground, right?
But that's not just a Colombia problem, right? That's the case in India. I'm sure that's the case in the United States as well. Washington, D.C. is at the center of power. But then, if there is indeed a disparity in power and access to resources between the center and the grassroots community, in your experience, with all the communities you worked with, and the places you've traveled to, do you sometimes find communities helpless and powerless in being able to drive change? Meaningful change? Do you find them like working with their hands tied behind their back, so to speak?
Look, I've seen so many experiences and I'm amazed of all the things they have been able to do with so little that I do not want to say that they have their hands tied because they have done so many things. I do believe, though, that they do need support from the center or from the privileged, as we can, say.
Can you give me an example?
Like, we just published a document on Acadesan, which is a community council in the Pacific, in Chocó, in the San Juan River. They live around the San Juan River. And they were able to negotiate with the government 50 measures for collective protection by themselves, doing different things by themselves.
What kind of things?
So they did, for example, mobilizations among the San Juan River. They came to Bogota to meet with different government agencies and sometimes had to sleep in their office outside until they were listened to or heard to. They did this advocacy campaign, it was called Operación Siriri.
Okay.
Siriri Operation. Siriri, it's a bird that it's very annoying. So they called it Operación Siriri. And they just kept going, sending letters, making calls, coming here to Bogota to meet with the people. And they were finally able to negotiate 50 measures. So to say, like for me to say that these communities are tied and do not have the capacity to be able to advocate for things to change, it's hard for me to believe because I've seen many different experiences that are just amazing, right? And they're on the ground and they were born there. Of course, they do need support from other national organizations and many other cooperation like agencies, like international agencies, but that's something that was born on the ground, and they believed in achieving, and they made it achieve.
That's really interesting. But
You're hesitant.
I am, yeah, because I can't seem to get over the fact that that a community-led network initiative has to sit outside a bureaucratic office for hours, practically banging on the door just to get a minute of
And
of
it shouldn't be
attention.
that way.
Exactly.
It should not be that way.
Which is what frustrates me about lines of work that rely on the attention of those in power. And it's one of the criticisms I have of peace building as can't call it an industry, but a sector, so to speak, right? I see this all around. One of the reasons why, for example, I even decided to start this podcast is because every conference we attend, there are practically the same organizations there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Every summit we attend, it's the same leaders, the same representatives, talking about the same agendas, in the same manner, with the same conclusions, more or less. But true peace building happens on the ground, through people and through initiatives that are seldom heard of. In your line of work, you returned to Colombia and you decided to step into research. Based on what you found in your initial few years or your beginning period, did you see a disparity between what you believed in and what you actually found upon doing research?
Yes, of course.
How?
You've read about the power of citizenship?
Yeah, of course.
And going to meet with those communities, you actually learn that there is such power. And why it's so important, accountability, why it's so important to have citizen participation, why it's so important to have citizen oversight. And then, of course, you see issues that would make their job easier, and that's how I see where I step in, or that our research center steps in to support those areas that may help do a better job advocating for their rights, for example.
Do you remember any one community that you worked with in your initial few years?
In exactly on
Yeah, like with the Center for Accountability. Any one community or network, any place that you traveled to, anything that you witnessed which left a lasting impression?
Well, I still work with them. It's the Foro Interétnico Solidaridad por Chocó, FISH, which is it's of course in Chocó, and it's a platform of different community councils and different organizations, around 123. And it amazes me every time I go to Quibdó to see their commitment with their community and all that they can do with so little. And to meet with those leaders that come from different places of Chocó.
What kind of things have they done, despite having a lack of resources?
For example, they do something very important, and it's when there's a humanitarian crisis, they're the first ones to arrive to the post where the situation happened. Before the government, before NGOs, before international organizations. They're the first ones to be at that place and to know about the situation and how they support each other and all the experiences they have supporting each other.
How were they affected by the conflict the first time that you met them?
The ELN mostly.
Are they
Confinement, displacement, killings of social leaders.
Do they still suffer from such crimes?
The situation there right now, it's very difficult.
So before we actually talk about the impact of the conflict as it's continuing, Do you feel scared when you travel to locations like these?
I felt scared once, and I think it was the last time I was there, where the ELN announced the lockdown in Quibdó.
What does that mean?
That people were not allowed to go out after the 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, wow. Like, did they say why?
No, they didn't. They just
And
announced that there was going to be a paro armado,
So when
and
you
there was a lockdown.
so when you go to such
I was
areas,
there.
what was that like?
No, I decided to change the flight, basically, which is for privileged people,
So
right?
basically, don't mess around with them.
No,
Just
I was
follow.
like, I have a daughter. I have a 5-year-old who depends 100% on me. I have to go home. And I decided to travel. All my friends who I work with over there,
Yeah.
they mocked me. They were like, Mariana, this is an everyday thing for us. It's like nothing's going to happen. Just like to be careful, right?
And how did your family react when they got to know? Oh,
Oh no,
okay.
they didn't know details about it.
Really?
Yeah, my dad, no.
And do they still don't know?
No, they don't.
Ay, ay, ay. Wow. Well,
They don't like really when
They-
I tell them that I have a trip there.
they clearly have a brave heart for a daughter. But
I don't give them much information. That's the best thing you can do.
Mom, Dad, the less you know, the better.
Yeah,
Been there, done that. I do it
especially
myself.
with my dad, who knows.
Yeah, and he's been there. He's
Yeah.
lived it. This was his life for many years. Totally understandable. And dads almost always have a soft spot for their daughters.
Daughters,
So,
yes.
Totally get it. But then, was that the first and only time where you actually
Yeah.
felt like you were caught in the crossfire?
Yeah, but it wasn't bad or nothing happened at the end, but it's something that it's difficult. And I think it was like a month ago or 2 months ago. No, a month ago. They broke into their office.
Whose office? Who broke into whose office?
We don't know who broke into their office, but they broke into their office, and I know that they've received threats. So I was going to travel last month, and I decided to wait until things calm down
They received threats
for the leaders that work for this organization.
because the guerrilla group had reservations about their work.
Yeah, because they have a lot of information of people on the ground. And
It can be pretty risky at times. But then, okay, look, so when you work with such communities, are they at all hopeful or optimistic about the conflict in their territory coming to an end? Or are they satisfied and content with the ALNA's presence? How does it work?
I'm gonna tell you something. Like, we started working with them before President Petro came into power.
Okay.
And when he became president, people were very hopeful. I have felt that hope has decreased. And that people are doubting more and less, more hesitant about the change, right? Because things have been going, like the implementation has been very slow. They thought that it was going to be faster. And the government's facing many issues and many difficulties on that regard. And I feel it has something to do with that complete change of governments. We had Duque before.
But then, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the current president was a former guerrilla member himself, right?
M19.
Right.
And
so
19, yeah.
One would, I think it's only intuitive and straightforward to believe that other guerrilla groups that continue existing would be somewhat sympathetic to the president and the government because once upon a time he was one of them.
Yeah, but I think that the guerrillas have changed a lot in their philosophy. And you will find in many territories that people receive threats from guerrilla members that are not actual guerrillas, that they're just delinquents. So, but they sign as if they were part of the guerrillas. And I think that the philosophy of the FARC and ELN in previous years, it's very different from now.
And the communities you work with, are they somewhat hopeful of well, let me put it differently. Are they content and satisfied with ALNA's governance and administration, or do they want the Colombian government to have a stronger presence?
They want a stronger presence, but they want a different kind of presence. Not only military. They want institutions to work. They want health. They want education. They want opportunity for their kids. And I've talked to communities that say that the way the conflict is, or the situation with the groups are very difficult now, because before they could pinpoint who was who in the community. Now they don't know who's working for who, even in the same family, circle. So there's a lot of, lack of trust between and it's breaking apart the communities. And that's something that came out in an event that we had 3 months ago, that it's really hard to know who is who, and it's breaking apart the social fabric of the communities.
But then, based on what you're saying, it seems to me that the communities themselves are lost in limbo, because it's like they're stuck somewhere in the middle. Because on the one hand, you've got the guerrilla groups, which will not allow state presence in their territory or area of control, and on the other hand, you've got the government, which is unwilling or unable, whichever way you look at it, to negotiate or settle the conflict with the guerrilla group, and they only have a military presence. So the government cannot establish state institutions or meet the socioeconomic needs of the community. But the only loser in all of this is
the communities.
Is the community.
They're stuck between fires, basically.
And does the Colombian government, or has the Colombian government in recent years exchanged fire with guerrilla groups, or is there a stalemate of sorts?
President Petro has not engaged into that.
At all?
I think very few cases. I don't have them present right now, but that's something that he has been avoiding. Some people say that he should be stronger on that side as well.
Yeah, in fact, that's the prevailing sentiment that even I've got from a lot of people, that he came in with a lot of promises, but he hasn't been able to deliver, unfortunately. So does your work only take you to Chocó or
to the Pacific, yeah.
To the
But
Pacific,
mostly
okay.
now to Chocó. And we meet usually in Quibdó.
Okay. And how often do you travel?
I travel every 2 months, and I hold meetings with the team in Quibdó every week.
Oh, cool. Virtual meetings. I'm
Virtual,
guessing.
yes. I just had one this morning to plan the activities, the upcoming activities.
What is your most memorable moment or trip working with local on-ground communities?
No, I think that what excites me most is to talk to the leaders. Maybe not during the meetings per se, but just grabbing a cup of coffee or having lunch together and
What is it that
hearing
fascinates you the most?
No, I think that it's the feeling of admiration for the work that they do.
You know, something I've heard a lot about Colombians in general was that, yeah, Colombians as a people generally are very sweet and very welcoming. But if you go outside the big cities, people will greet you on the streets like, hey, ¿cómo estás? Come over for lunch.
Yeah.
Have you had coffee? No, let's go meet for coffee. It's a lot more laid back.
Yes.
Outside the big cities. Is that the kind of lifestyle that you enjoy as well?
Yeah, I go to Quibdó and
Okay.
people say hi to me on the streets and it's like they know me already. It's amazing.
So do people...
They're very welcoming.
How so? Like, do you have any one memory to share?
No, I just I go to the hotel and the guy greets me like, Mariana, we have your favorite room ready, you know?
Wow.
Like, yeah, stuff like that. Or go to the restaurant and they remember you and they're like, the usual, do you want to have the usual thing that you have here? And it's great.
So they...
Or they tease me, like, Quibdó, it's very humid.
Uh-huh.
So I like walking a lot, so it's just like I'm just like really like wet and like sweating, and they're just like, oh, la cachaca llegó, like the people from the person from the interior of the country has arrived, you know, and I'm just like, yeah, no,
That's
I
really
love
sweet.
going there. I wish I could go there more often, but yeah, it's amazing.
Does it always happen to you that when you go there, you don't feel like coming back?
Yeah.
All the
Yeah,
time?
it's like I don't want to go. Like, and they cancel flights all the time, and I'm just like, please.
So all these experiences that you have with communities, eating local food, being greeted in local customary ways, does it ever put you in a space of dilemma, knowing fully well that you're only going to see this community and experience this lifestyle
Yeah, of course.
periodically, but then you've got a completely different lifestyle to go back
Of course.
to. How do you deal with that?
I deal that in a way, like what I feel sometimes, it's like there's, in the position I'm in, how can I help? Right? And that's something that we always tell them. How can I be of help? Not, oh, I can help you with this, as if they need my help, but like, how can I be of help? Which is different, I think.
Do they look for help actively?
No, but we talk about the needs that they have or the challenges that they're facing. And then we validate with them that through our activity of what we can help with is enough for them or could be helpful to them.
But would you find yourself doing this if you were not with the American Center, for example? In other words, let's say you were an ordinary citizen having a completely different job, working in a different sector. Would you still offer the kind of help and support to local communities?
If I
that
can,
you do?
yes, absolutely.
You still would?
If I have the time, if I have the resources to do so, yes.
So in other words...
And that's the thing that I love most about my job. Not the research, but the actual job with the communities and how I can help out with the things, with my knowledge, with the things I know. And they have the important knowledge, it's on them, right? That's how we see it.
So what is a part of your job that you absolutely love? And what is the part that, well, could be better? Or could be different?
The thing that I love the most, it's just being with the communities and talking to them. What I don't like, it's the fundraising. I hate. Well, not I don't hate it, but I think it's very challenging. But fortunately, we have really good donors right now, and we get along very well. But that part, like looking for the resources, it's really hard, and sometimes it's very challenging. For example, we did an event like learning exchange with communities from the Pacific, indigenous and Afro-Colombians on collective protection.
Right.
And we did a learning exchange of 4 days or something like that. And there's so many like needs and challenges that they're facing. And you end the event and you're just like, what now? Like, there's so many things to do, and we don't have the resources to support them in that. Not right now. Like, we're looking into supporting them, but right now we don't have the resources or the capacity to help with so much, right? So, but I do feel if we can help a little, it's something, right?
Fundraising in peace building, really interesting topic. Okay, so like we talked about before, right? Peace building is not an area that is set in stone within the Sustainable Development Goals, but it is a topic of interest for the United Nations, international institutions, various governments, etc. Outside of governments and institutions, do you see there being a genuine desire and appetite to fund peace-building projects beyond the limited conventional or traditional understanding of peace-building being, well, the absence of conflict? Do you think there is an appetite to support work like that?
No, I think that it's starting, like you start to see support in different areas that looks at peace building in a broader sense. And I do think, like, for example, productive, like, crops or, projects like that within communities who've lived a conflict and stuff like that.
I mean, where the gauging or measuring the impact of peace building is concerned, it's a little difficult to do that, right? Because when you
measure peace?
Yeah.
Oh, very difficult.
Exactly, because a lot of peace building initiatives are, concerned with a person's mental and emotional well-being. Yeah.
And that's not enough.
And that's not enough. I mean, simply, erecting a mobile phone tower in a community or ensuring that a community gets regular drinking water, again, that's one way you can measure peace or by meeting the socioeconomic needs, but it runs deeper. Now, a lot of donors, to my understanding, look for metrics that can actively measure or quantify the impact of the projects that they're funding. How do you go about that?
So last year we started with a project with one of our donors here in Colombia that donates to 17 organizations here in Colombia that have to do with peace building. That's why we went to the Shift the Power event, and that's where we met.
Yeah.
And one of that organizations, it's called Everyday Peace Indicators. And what they do is that they build peace indicators with the communities.
Right.
They're the ones who decide which indicators and what peace means to them. And it's been like very interesting to me because I've always seen, and being in the government, there are certain indicators set that we've measured for decades that tell us about the conflict or violence or different aspects, right? And with these indicators, people are measuring peace from the bottom up and not from the top down, which is what is usually done with the UN, with the official data, right? And it's very interesting. We had a conversation this week, or it was on Thursday, with one of the organizations that is working with us, and they did the exercise with their communities. And they were saying stuff like being able to sit on the patio at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. That's peace for us.
Right.
Or our daughters not being married with people from the illegal groups, or be taken away by them. That's how they call it. Or being able to go to the park with the kids, or not having curfews, stuff like that. Or and one of the persons mentioned a couple of months ago, and I think that's something that I told you when we first spoke, was the sleeping with a pajama on. For them, like, I think it's very telling. we don't have to sleep with our clothes on and our boots on to, because the illegal groups are going to arrive to our home and we're going to have to run. So being able to sleep with their pajamas on, for them is an indicator of peace, right?
So in other words...
And that's something that in the government, they're not, it's something that it's not relevant or...
So in other words, what you're saying is that it's necessary for funding peace-building initiatives to develop indicators that speak to local contexts.
Yeah, of course.
And do you feel in your years of working and experience, donors are open to that?
No, they're not. Most of them are not.
How so? Why is that?
Because they have their own agendas and they have their own, people to respond to. It's, it's like they have to show, to report on their progress as well. And that's the language that they use.
So two things. Now, is it then fair to say that donors, when it comes to funding peace-building projects, A, do it for the glamour, and B, they're not in it for the long haul?
Yeah, especially with social issues, it's really hard to measure impact.
Yeah, of course.
It's very hard, and they have to do it in any way. And sometimes I've spoken to many grassroots organizations on the ground, and they're like, we end up doing work that is not useful to us, but to them. And it shouldn't be that way. It should not be that way. But of course, they have to report on, on the chain of command, like up there, and that's... And documents that no one's going to read. Great point.
We'll get to that. That is something I really want to scrutinize further. The relevance of writing. Yeah, it's something I want to scrutinize further. The relevance of writing and issuing publications, reports, and what have you. Do communities recognize when you are doing the bidding of those that are funding your projects? Are they able to see through it?
To see what?
In the sense, like, let's say you get funding from donor A. You go into a community, you try and work with the local leaders, community representatives, and tell them, look, we have resources to fund something that you want to do. Mm-hmm. But we want you to do it this way and not your way. Are communities able to see through that?
Of course, yeah, they're aware of that.
How do they react to that? How do they
they're like some of we work differently, and I'm going to explain how we work. But they see it as if something good comes out of it, even if it's a small thing, to get something we need, we'll hire someone else to do that report. And that's what they do.
Okay.
Just to check the box. And to turn in what they requested, basically.
So in other words, communities that you work with are somewhat open to having projects being implemented in their spaces with foreign funding, provided it's done on their terms. Would that be accurate to say?
Well, that's the ideal sometimes. But they are aware, many of them are aware that there are some projects that they're just not going to do. And they do not, they see that there's no point on doing, because they don't get anything in return, basically, that's needed to their own organization.
Projects like? Do you
I
remember any?
don't know the exact, but let's say something that it's not an expertise of the organization, and they want them to do it. They're gonna say no, right? And I've seen that in a lot of cases, like they, don't agree on that. Many do because they need it, right? But many don't. And how we work is that we're in constant communication. We work with partners in the different countries that we work in, and allies, and we have conversations with them to learn what it is that they need. And after we have an idea of what it is that they need, we start looking for resources that would want to support that initiative. And in the case of Colombia, for example, we have not gotten any requirement for our donors, which is something that does not happen that often, right? We do have a conversation with our donors. We tell them what we're doing, and that's it. And they support the initiative how it comes, and it's a flexible process.
Super
But
interesting.
we respond to the needs of our partners in Colombia.
You mentioned reports and publications. It's one of the few reservations I have about the relevance and the impact of peace building work. Articles are written by the dozens or hundreds per minute, and they're published across platforms online. The language used, in my experience, in those reports is pretty dense.
Yeah.
Almost always, inevitably. And there are some reports and publications that appeal to specific donor expectations and needs, which are written in a completely different way. Do you see that as relevant? Do you see that as important at all? Do you see that as a need within peace building? How do you see it?
I think that publications and reports should serve more to the organization than to the donors.
Explain.
I feel that sometimes donors request certain documents just to serve their job and to report to their bosses or to the board of directors, and not to be helpful to the communities directly and to the organizations.
Yeah, but then, as we discussed earlier, peace building essentially caters to people, right?
Yeah.
It caters to people and their needs, communities even. How does a report or a publication directly help the community?
Well, it depends on the publication.
Give me an example.
If it's a publication about an experience of an organization and how they were successful, for example, in achieving their goal, that might be helpful to other organizations.
Right.
And
Okay.
learning, right? Learning from different experiences.
Have you seen that happen in your own experience?
Yes.
How?
With the document that we just launched, for example.
Okay.
The one on the experience of Acadesan.
But
We've had challenges, and that's something that we talk a lot about with our team members at ARC, and it's the fact, for example, that Afro-Colombian communities and ethnic communities in general are very oral, and they sometimes are not going to read a piece, but they're going to listen to a testimony or a song. Many of them do songs explaining laws that came out, which is amazing. So they communicate in different ways, and that way that shows that we need to be able to reach our audiences in different ways as well, and not a 30-40-page report.
And what are some of the other ways you think could be more effective in reaching audiences within peace building?
Local communities, when we're talking about local communities?
Could be anything. Local communities, could be prospective donors, could be members of the public.
Yeah, like for donors, for example, going to the ground and see what the communities are doing on the ground. Many of them don't even know where the location of the communities they're supporting are located, right? Go speak to them and see how the project is actually helping or would be able to help. Get to know the communities and work with them. Get more involved.
Like, have donors ever actually traveled with you?
No, but we're planning on doing so.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But then, in your experience, like, this is something I come across very commonly, right? At least with members of the public that I speak to. Communications or any creative approaches to peace building are almost always lacking.
Okay.
Among many other things. What is it within peace building on a broader scale that you think the sector lacks when it comes to communicating and talking about their work and generating impact? Surely, writing reports and publishing articles can't be the only answer.
No, and this has to do with communications as well, but actually understand and listen to what the needs of the communities are.
That's interesting. And you think donors and organizations are not doing that enough?
No, they're not. They have an idea of what's peace building to them, but they have not sat down with the communities themselves and see what they see, as peace and what peace means to them. And there's an example with the case of Akale-san. I say that sometimes governments and donors work in the same way, but they were telling me that they wanted to build a community center. And the government, that has nothing to do with peace building, with protection, that we're not supporting that, and it does have to do a lot with peace building. But they didn't even want to hear why it meant that it's, related to peace building. So people need to communicate more and to understand more the context. And the only way you understand the context is to talk to the people and to go to the communities.
In your personal life, have you ever encountered people who raise their eyebrow in confusion when you told them, I work in peace building? Ever happened with you?
No, see, in my job specifically, it's a bit different because we don't work specifically on peace building. Mm-hmm. We work on accountability, transparency, but it depends on we also work on education, health, and different areas. So yeah. And yeah, my friends sometimes are like, peace building, really?
like, do they look down upon peace building, or is it just because they don't understand what peace building is?
Well, many of them don't understand and are not really interested on that. I see.
Why? What kind of work? What kind of jobs do they do?
Well, I think that many people live on bubbles, right? And they have not seen the problem in that way. Or they're friends of mine, for example, that the conflict affects them in what they do in their everyday lives, but they don't understand the other side of the conflict, or they're not interested in knowing it or learning about it, right? So they're just interested on that. For example, they close roads that take me to my farms in the south of the country, and I'm unable to get there because of the conflict. But they don't see the victims of the conflict, like the people that have been displaced of their territories or confined, so it varies a lot, and it's really hard to talk about those things.
Do you remember the first time you met a victim of the conflict?
The first time.
Was there ever a time in your life where you found yourself in a similar kind of bubble, and did that bubble burst when you met a victim or a survivor of the conflict, or somebody who was directly involved in the conflict either?
No, I think that in my mind, I've always known people that have been affected by the conflict in one way or the other. I could not pinpoint a person when I was 13, I met the first. No, it's always been present in my life, I think.
Through your father or other people?
Yeah, my father, friends at school whose parents were kidnapped, the bombings here in Bogota during the 90s, co-workers of my parents who had to flee their lands and go somewhere else. Yeah, wow. It's always been present.
And when you experienced bombings, Bogota, where were you in those times? At home?
At home.
And was there a general
Yeah, but with the bombing here, the Club El Nogal, for example, I was 5 blocks away. And I heard the explosion. I drove through it and you could see people, like the ambulances and the trucks and the fire trucks and everything.
Wow. Did anybody in your family or your father ground you at home for security purposes?
Yeah.
That happened?
Yeah. And my dad still, to this day, whenever I'm 42 years old almost, whenever I go out, I have to check in. I'm fine, I'm home.
Every time?
Every time.
Can't imagine what that would feel like.
Yeah. And it's normal. Like for me, it's normal. Oh, I have to check in with my dad, you know. And many of my friends do. Or with my mom, or tell them at least where you're going to be at, you know.
Yeah. Is that because of the childhood that you saw, as a witness to the conflict, or is that generally because the security situation in Bogota is a little questionable?
Well, I think it's both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's both. But something that was really strange for me when I started school here in the university was seeing military. If you see military people here, like soldiers or whatever, they have their name tags on their shoelaces, in their boots. Like a metal.
No way.
Like a metal tag.
For what? Like a dog tag?
Yeah, sort of like a dog tag. So if they're murdered, and they're unrecognizable, that's the way they know who was killed.
You serious?
Yeah, and they were sitting, they would just stand outside the campus, you know, with their uniforms and stuff, and you would see the guys with the tags on their shoelaces. And it was very, for me, it was like, I had just, come back from the US, and for me that was very, shocking. I had a boyfriend in the university he was in a well-to-do family, and they couldn't go to their farms. They had mangostino plantations. I don't know if you've tried it. And they couldn't go to their farms, and the only way to get there was through planes. And they shot down the plane of his sister. And she was killed, her husband was killed, and her 2 sons were killed.
And this was a civilian airplane?
Yeah, this was 2000 or 1999, something like that.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So there's so many layers and so many shapes of the conflict. And my conclusion, we're all victims. And victimaries as well.
Including the ones who actively perpetrate violence. Would you count them as victims of the conflict as well?
In some way, yeah. Because they didn't have the opportunity to have any other choice. Something in life led them to choose that life. Or not even choose. Some people didn't even have the choice. Like the kids that were kidnapped and were forced to become part of the groups. These are children.
In other words, you say that they deserve a bit of sympathy?
No, not sympathy, but I think it's important to understand that we're all, or not, I don't want to include myself there, but they're all victims of the conflict in different ways.
So they must be held.
That's why the peace agreement is so important, because it wants to get to the root cause of the problems.
But then even 8 years on, so many people say that it's not like the root causes of the conflict have been addressed fully.
No, it has not been addressed.
So you're saying that it's one thing to recognize and look at people who have been affected, who are, well, even those who perpetrate violence, as victims, in one way, from one perspective. But at the same time, they must be held accountable for what they did.
Yes.
Okay. Which actually brings me to, well, the closest people you consider in your life. Clearly, a lot changed for you personally and professionally once you returned from the United States. What was it like for your friends and people in your life? Did they, for example, for them, was it business as usual? Life goes on? Or for them, did things change in a profound manner?
No, I think it was. We have to understand also that people in Bogota, and this is where I live, have not been exposed to the conflict as much as in other areas of the country, like the South, like the West, North. But Bogota, by the conflict, not so much as other parts of the country. The thing that I've seen with close friends from here, which I have, it's very, my group of friends is very varied. So I have all kinds of friends, but I do have some friends that have, for example, farms in the South.
Right.
That they could not go at some point, and were able to go in Uribe's government. So that's why they're supporters of the right, because when he was in power, they were able to go back to their farms.
Yeah.
Right? And they're afraid that things are going to go back and they're not going to be able to go back to those places. And that's their jobs, basically, with plantations, with...
So, to conclude, essentially, when I look at the peace agreement and the image, I have a lot of mixed emotions.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, I listen to, well, stories of death, loss, sorrow, sadness, which without a doubt are deeply sobering. But on the other hand, there is another side to this issue, debate, discussion, whatever you call it, where, yes, there is an end to violence, but violence is still being perpetrated in different ways. Structural, for example, psychological, social, economic, so on and so forth, which the peace agreement attempted to address, but governments after the peace agreement was signed have not been able to, or have been unwilling to do, depending on who you speak to. So, 8 years on, knowing fully well and realizing that you work with communities now who, in one way or another, were directly affected by the conflict, having people and friends in your life who were affected by the conflict, and yet having those people who deny the conflict altogether, knowing such people, even as acquaintances. What do you see as the future for peace and peace building? And two, what do you see as the future for Colombia? Long question. It's a slightly complex one.
I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight after that question.
No, you know what? It's just something that, well, to be fair, there's a lot of structural, social, economic violence in India as well. And it's a question that, as a peace builder myself, working in a slightly niche area of peace building, it's something that I grapple with all the time. The privilege that I find myself in, I will admit, to some extent, makes me feel guilty. Because there are people who are far less than me, but are able to generate a lot more impact.
Yeah.
So it's a question that I grapple with at times, a lot.
But being in Colombia, at the heart of, well, a country that went through decades of conflict, it's a question that I can't help but ask. What's it like for you?
Like, I know it's not in my power to change things. But I think that I'm always going to be working on this area of work to be able to contribute in some way. And I think that if we all start thinking about it that way, we can make like things change, you know? And we need to start thinking about peace in a broader way, listening to the communities on the ground to see what it is that they need, to listen more and not to impose things, because that hasn't worked. And that sense of being superior that we often see on cooperation, on the government, on different things, that we have the solution and we know what development is and we know what peace building is, and it's not that way. That answer is on the ground, and the communities have that answer. Many of them know exactly what it is that they need to be able to have better qualities of life. And we're always going to have conflict. That's like part of, humanity, basically. But we need to learn, to be able to solve things and to decrease that risk, basically, and to have better opportunities for people and their livelihoods. And
do you see hope for Colombia in that regard?
I think that because we're many people that believe that things can be done, that, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, I do. I've never thought about having a peace agreement with the FARC, and we did. We've had challenges in the implementation, but I never imagined before the negotiations started that this was even possible, to tell you the truth. So everything's possible.
And on that note, thanks so much, Mariana. It was a
thank
pleasure.
You so much.
It was amazing having you on the podcast.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. At Pax Politica, we tell stories throughout the world of peacebuilding and human rights that aren't covered by mainstream media. And every bit of support from you would help us do exactly that. So hit that like button and share the video with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you next time, and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.